I was still in my church clothes, sitting in my truck in the parking lot, when Mike called. He'd been working on the electrical in Elena's studio for 3 weeks. I'd never heard anything but calm in that man's voice. Arthur. A pause that went on too long. You need to come home right now. And come alone. I opened the studio door. Elena's tools were right where she'd left them. An unfinished piece of wood still sat on the workbench. She'd been gone 14 months, and I hadn't touched a single thing in that room. That's when Mike pointed to the hole in the drywall. And I saw it. A gray metal lockbox, bolted hard to the wall stud. Hidden there on purpose. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 65 years old. I spent 40 years designing bridges, structures built to hold. I thought I knew what it meant for something to be solid. Elena and I had a friend of 30 years. He was a financial advisor, and at my own request, he had been managing everything we'd built together as a couple. I trusted him without question. Not once did I doubt him. If you want to know what happens next, please subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Inside that box were bank accounts I'd never seen, contracts I'd never signed, and one man's name on every page. His name, my oldest friend. For 16 months, he and Elena had been meeting without me, making decisions without me, hiding something from me. And I only found out after my wife was already gone. The quarterly statement arrived on a Tuesday, the way most things that change your life do quietly. Without ceremony, slipped between a grocery circular and a bill for the water heater inspection. Arthur Vance set it on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup and didn't open it right away. He stood at the window first, looking out at the backyard, where the dogwood tree Elena had planted their second spring in this house was beginning to show the pale green promise of new buds. April was trying its best. The sky above the Blue Ridge was the particular shade of washed blue that only appeared for about 3 weeks a year in Asheville. And Arthur had learned, over 43 years of living here, that this color meant the cold had finally meant it when it left. He was 65 years old. He had retired 14 months ago from the firm where he had spent 4 decades designing bridges, real ones. The kind that carried school buses and ambulances over mountain rivers. The kind whose tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. Because thousandths of an inch was the difference between a family making it home and a family not making it home. He understood load-bearing structures. He understood the mathematics of trust. He sat down, pulled the statement toward him, and put on his reading glasses. The account balance was the first thing that caught him, not the number itself, which had been shrinking in ways Julian had always explained away with the careful vocabulary of a man who knew that older clients stopped asking questions when the language became sufficiently technical. What caught Arthur was a line item near the bottom of the 3rd page, below the management fee and above the reinvestment summary. It read Consultation Services Quarterly Premium Advisory $2,000. Arthur set down his coffee cup. He turned back to the previous quarter's statement, which he kept in a manila folder in the second drawer of the kitchen desk. Elena had organized that drawer. And he hadn't reorganized it since, and he didn't intend to. He found the matching section. No such line item. He pulled the quarter before that. Nothing. He went back 18 months through the folder, spreading statements across the kitchen table, until the table looked like the surface of a workbench mid-project, papers overlapping, edges curling. The line item appeared exactly twice this quarter, and 12 months ago, in a statement. He realized now he hadn't examined carefully because Elena had been in the hospital that week for what the cardiologist called an episode, and Arthur had been in no state to examine anything carefully. $4,000, total, for a service he had never approved. Never discussed, and he was nearly certain of this, because he was the kind of man who was nearly certain of things never received. He set the statement down and looked at the window again. The dogwood was still there. The blue sky was still there. Something else was in the room now, though. Something that felt the way a hairline crack feels when you're running your hand along a concrete pylon in the dark. Not visible, not measurable yet, but present. Real. The smell of cedar drifted in from the workshop. It came through the door that connected the kitchen to the side passage. The one that led to the small outbuilding Elena had converted from a garden shed into her studio 12 years ago. She had spent weekends in there with her chisels and her router and her listening ear for the particular way different. Wood spoke when you worked against their grain. Walnut for jewelry boxes. Cherry for frames. Cedar for the birdhouses she had sold at the River Arts District Market every November. The ones that sold out before 10 in the morning because people drove from 3 counties over to buy them. Arthur had not gone into the workshop in 4 months. Not since the December afternoon when he had walked in to retrieve a Phillips head screwdriver and found himself standing in the middle of the room. Unable to move, surrounded by the smell of her work and the sight of the half-finished birdhouse still clamped in the vise on the main bench. Waiting for hands that would not return to it. He had stood there for 11 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch when he finally got himself to the door. He didn't go in now either. He stood in the kitchen doorway and let the smell come to him, the way you let a cat come to you when you know chasing it will only push it further away. He was still standing there when his phone rang. It was Mike Callahan, the electrician who had been working through the house in stages since February. Rewiring the original 1970s panel that Arthur had been meaning to update for longer than he cared to admit. Mike was a solid man, heavy-set, quiet, the kind of tradesman who communicated primarily through the quality of his work and the directness of his invoices. "Arthur," Mike said, "I need you to come out to the workshop. I found something behind the drywall on the north interior wall. You're going to want to see this in person." Arthur put on his jacket. The workshop air was cool and layered cedar on top, beneath it. The mineral smell of sawdust and linseed oil, beneath that something older and more permanent, the accumulated breath of a decade of patient making. Elena's chisels hung in their rack above the secondary bench. Her apron was folded over the stool by the window, the leather worn smooth along the front edges where she had habitually wiped her hands. Arthur kept his eyes away from the vise. He had learned to navigate the room by looking at the periphery. Mike was crouched near the north wall, his work lamp angled at a section of drywall he had removed a roughly 2-foot square of it. Leaning against the baseboard to access the wiring chase behind. He stood when Arthur entered and pointed at the opening without saying anything first. Which was exactly the kind of communication Arthur had come to rely on from him. Set into the gap between 2 wall studs, bolted to the face of the 2x4 framing with 4 concrete screws, was a gray metal lockbox. It was approximately the size of a shoebox, with a combination dial on the front and a hardened steel latch. It had not been placed casually. Whoever had put it there had drilled pilot holes, used the right screws for the application, and made sure the box was level. Arthur could see the pencil mark on the framing where the measurement had been taken. "Found it behind the insulation when I pulled it back to get to the junction box," Mike said. "It didn't get there by accident." He wiped his hands on a shop rag, a gesture that seemed to indicate he understood this had moved beyond his area of responsibility. "I'll give you some time." Arthur waited until he heard Mike's boots on the gravel outside. Then he crouched in front of the opening. The box was cold. He had not been expecting that, not the specific weight of the cold against his fingertips when he pressed them to the metal. Not the way it seemed to pull heat from his hands rather than simply lack warmth. He rested his palm flat against the surface for a moment. Elena used their wedding anniversary for everything. The garage keypad, the storage unit, the laptop password that she had told him once and that he had written on the back of a grocery receipt in case he forgot. Which he never did. 1014. October 14th. He turned the dial. Right to 1. Left past 0, twice around, to 10. Right to 1, past it, back to 1. Left to 4. The latch clicked open with a sound that was small and definitive. Arthur remained crouched, not moving, for several seconds. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of Mike loading tools into his truck. The dogwood in the backyard was not visible from here, but he knew it was there. He thought about the quarterly statement on the kitchen table. The $2,000 line he had never approved, the way a hairline crack spread when you stopped watching it. He lifted the lid. "I thought I knew every inch of this house," he realized, in the way that a man realizes something not as a thought, but as a fact that reorganizes everything around it. "I thought I knew every inch, and now the walls are speaking, and I am terrified of what they're going to say." The latch had made a sound like something snapping into place, or, he thought, like something snapping apart. He wasn't sure yet which one it was. He lifted the box from its mount. It was heavier than its size suggested, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with its contents. And everything to do with the weight that was already gathering around it. He carried it to the kitchen table, set it beside the statements that were still spread across the surface, and looked at the two objects together. The quarterly statement from Julian Thorne at Meridian Wealth Partners, and a gray metal box his wife had hidden inside a wall of their home. He sat down slowly. He did not open it again right away. The afternoon light was changing in the kitchen, the blue sky day beginning its tilt toward evening, and Arthur sat very still with his hands folded on the table, an engineer who understood load-bearing structures, trying to calculate the weight of what was coming. He opened the box in the early morning. He had carried it to the bedroom and set it on Elena's side of the dresser and gone to sleep. Or tried to, waking 3 times in the night to look at the dark shape of it against the wall. And at 5:15, when the first thin gray light came through the curtains, he got up, made coffee, and brought it to the kitchen table. He lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was the USB drive. It was a small one, the kind that looked like a flash drive but shorter, in a soft rubber sleeve. Elena had labeled it with a strip of white masking tape and written on it in her precise carpenter's hand, "Julian accounts do not erase." He set it carefully on the table. Beneath the USB drive was a blue pill organizer, the weekly kind, with individual compartments labeled SMTWTFS, the kind Arthur himself had used for a while after his blood pressure diagnosis. This one was Elena's, but he didn't recognize it. He had managed her medications in the last year of her illness, and her daily supplements had always been kept in a white organizer on the bathroom counter. He had never seen this blue one. He turned it over. The compartments were not empty. In Sunday through Wednesday, there were pills, small, off-white capsules with no visible markings. In Thursday through Saturday, the compartments were empty, and there was a strip of paper folded into Saturday's section. He unfolded it carefully. In Elena's handwriting from JT 123. Twice weekly. For the palpitations. He set the organizer on the table beside the USB drive and looked at the third item. It was a notebook, not a store-bought journal, but a carpenter's field notebook, the kind with the stiff cardboard cover and graph paper pages that Elena used for measurements and joinery notes. This one had no measurements in it. The cover was blank, but inside the front cover, in the same precise hand that had labeled everything she made, she had written a title, "The Price of Trust." The first entry was dated 16 months before her death. Arthur read it. He read it slowly, the way he read structural drawings, not for the general picture, but for the tolerances, for the specific numbers, for the places where the data diverged from the expected values. His coffee went cold beside him. The early morning light moved from gray to pale gold to the full brightness of a spring morning, and he did not look up from the notebook once. Elena had kept records. Meticulous, dated, sourced records, the kind of documentation that took patience and care and a specific kind of cold-eyed discipline to maintain while your health was deteriorating. And your husband was doing everything Julian Thorne suggested because he trusted Julian Thorne, and you couldn't tell him why you had stopped. The first entry read, "Julian said the $15,000 transfer was for a bond reinvestment. I checked the account online using the secondary login he doesn't know I have. The bond doesn't exist. There is no CUSIP number. There is no settlement date. The money transferred to an account I cannot identify." 2 weeks later called Meridian's compliance office using a different name. Asked about the bond. They confirmed no such instrument was purchased through our account in the last 6 months. Julian is lying. He has been lying. A month after that second transfer confirmed. $8,200. Same pattern. Same unidentifiable account number. I've been photographing the statements before Arthur sees them. He trusts Julian. He believes Julian is managing everything. I cannot tell him yet. Julian knows our routines. He knows when Arthur is home and when he isn't. I need more evidence before I say anything, because if I say something too early and it can't be proven, Julian will cover it and Arthur will think I was confused. I will not be dismissed as confused. Arthur sat with the notebook open on the table and understood, slowly and completely, that his wife had been dying and had spent her remaining energy not resting. Not conserving herself, not simply being held but building a case. while he was upstairs at night worrying about her oxygen levels and her medication schedule and whether she was eating enough. She had been down here, or in the workshop, or somewhere, quietly and methodically documenting a theft. He turned to the back of the notebook, where Elena had tucked several loose papers. The first was a bank notice, a notice of delinquent mortgage that Arthur had never seen, stamped second notice, dated 8 months ago. The mailing address was correct. He had never seen it. He thought about the mail. Julian had offered, 2 years ago when Elena first got sick. And Arthur was stretched thin between the hospital and the house and the 100 logistics of a life reorganizing itself around illness, to help manage correspondence. Just the financial stuff, Arthur. Let me handle the paper trail so you can focus on Elena. He had been grateful. He had given Julian a forwarding arrangement for account statements and bank correspondence. He had thought it was a kindness. The second loose paper was a receipt from a local specialty wellness shop, stapled to a handwritten note. The receipt was for something called a Vitality Care Basket Cedar Aromatherapy Oil, herbal teas, and a bottle of premium herbal supplements labeled Heart Harmony Formula. The total was $89. The date was 10 months before Elena's death. The note was handwritten on Meridian Wealth Partners stationery, in a broad, practiced script that Arthur recognized immediately. It read, "For your health, Elena. Your heart is in good hands. J." Arthur put the note down. He looked at the blue pill organizer on the table. He looked at the unmarked capsules in the compartments. He looked at the receipt with Julian Thorne's handwriting on it, warm and friendly and deliberate. He thought about the cardiologist's report from Elena's last 6 months, the unexplained deterioration in cardiac rhythm that had not responded to standard treatment. The progressive weakening the doctors had attributed to an underlying condition they could not fully characterize. He thought about how many times he had handed Elena a glass of water and watched her swallow the capsules Julian had sent, watched her make a face at their bitterness, watched her look at him with those dark, steady eyes that he had always interpreted as peace. She had not been at peace. She had been keeping a secret. She had been keeping it specifically to protect him, and it had cost her whatever fighting time she might have had left. He turned to the last entry in the notebook, dated 3 weeks before Elena was admitted to the hospital for the final time. The handwriting was slightly larger than the earlier entries, more effortful, but still precise in its factual content. Total documented transfers $94,000 across 14 transactions, 14 months. Julian's assistant has confirmed he handles our account personally, no delegation. USB drive contains screenshots of account activity and copies of wire transfer records obtained through secondary login. If something happens to me, and I believe it will, Arthur needs to find this box. I've left the combination where only he would know it. I love him. He is not to blame. He trusted because that is who he is, and who he is good. I watched her waste away, Arthur thought, the thought arriving not as language but as physical fact, settling into his chest and sternum with the weight of something structural failing. I watched her waste away, thinking it was her heart, thinking Julian Thorne was our friend, thinking the capsules I handed her with a glass of water were helping her. I was the one delivering whatever was in those capsules. I was the mechanism of it, and I didn't know. I didn't know. He closed the notebook very gently, the way you close something irreplaceable. The kitchen lights flickered once, a brief, stuttering dimming and brightening that lasted perhaps half a second, casting long shadows on the floor that stretched toward the window and the ordinary April morning beyond it. Arthur sat in the flickering light with Elena's notebook under his hand and understood that whatever shape his grief had taken for the past 14 months, it was going to have to take a different shape now. There was no more room in him for passive sorrow. Something else was beginning. He was not sure yet what to call it. He was sure it had a direction. The Asheville Country Club's spring fundraiser was the kind of event Arthur had attended exactly 3 times in 12 years, always at Julian's invitation. Always feeling slightly underdressed and slightly too aware of the difference between men who had built things and men who had managed other people's money while the building was happening. The main room smelled of expensive perfume and old wood and fresh-cut flowers. The combination of scents that institutions like this cultivated deliberately to suggest permanence. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with silver trays. Laughter arrived from multiple directions, layered and practiced. Arthur stood near the entrance in his good navy blazer and the tie Elena had given him for their 35th anniversary, and found Julian Thorne across the room without difficulty. Julian was easy to find in rooms like this. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and the easy tan of someone who had recently been somewhere warm. He stood at the center of a small cluster of people, all of them angled slightly toward him in the posture of people enjoying the company of someone compelling. He was in the middle of a story. He was already laughing before the punchline arrived. Arthur crossed the room. The story concluded just as Arthur reached Julian's elbow. Appreciation from the cluster. A woman in a green dress touching Julian's arm. Julian turned, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted in his expression. It was small. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But Arthur had spent 4 decades reading the faces of contractors who were about to minimize structural problems, and he caught it precisely. Then Julian smiled wide, warm, practiced. Arthur, I didn't know you were coming tonight. It's good to see you getting out. We need to talk, Julian. Julian glanced at his group, a quick, apologetic tilt of the head that communicated both regret and mild amusement. Excuse me for just a moment. He steered Arthur toward the tall windows overlooking the terrace with a hand briefly at his back, and turned to face him with an expression of careful concern. Arthur recognized the expression. It was the same one Julian used across the desk when he was about to explain something complex in a tone that suggested the explanation was a generous gift. The quarterly statement, Arthur said. The consultation fee, $2,000. I never authorized it. Julian nodded slowly, processing. I hear that, Arthur. And I take it seriously. He paused. But I also want to be honest with you, because I consider myself your friend. I've been worried about you. Since Elena, the isolation, the withdrawal. The mortgage notice I never received, Arthur said. The 14 transactions totaling $94,000 that Elena documented in a notebook she hid inside the wall of her workshop. Something shifted in Julian's eyes. Not the expression held completely, warm and pained and concerned. Just the eyes, dropping a degree in temperature, recalibrating behind the warmth like something cold moving beneath still water. He placed his hand on Arthur's shoulder, heavy, deliberate, positioned at the exact angle that made it visible to the nearest cluster of guests as a gesture of support. A prop in a performance that had been staged before. Arthur. His voice lifted just enough to reach the nearby conversations, then dropped into something private and intimate. Something whose tone could be observed without its content being precisely heard. Grief does such strange things to the mind. I've seen it, with clients our age. First comes the cognitive decline, and then these accusations about missing funds, about money that was properly managed. I have her ledger, Julian. And I understand it, Julian continued, without pausing, as though Arthur had not spoken. Which is why I haven't said anything to anyone yet about how confused you've seemed. How concerning it's been. His hand pressed once on Arthur's shoulder, a brief, firm pressure that was not comfort. Maybe it's time we discussed a conservatorship. For your own protection. Someone to help you manage the complexity you're clearly finding overwhelming. His eyes had gone fully cold now. They were the eyes of a man who had run this calculation before, who knew its outcome: a 65-year-old widower, bankrupt, socially isolated. Making accusations in a room full of wealthy witnesses. Who would they believe? The grieving old man who seemed confused? Or the silver-haired wealth manager who had been a pillar of this community for 2 decades? Who was even now displaying such patient, pained concern for his troubled client? Arthur looked around. The woman from the library board had turned away. A man nearby had developed a sudden interest in the view through the window. The expressions on the nearest faces were careful and neutrally pitying. The expression of people who have decided this is none of their business and are waiting for it to resolve itself. Julian stepped back, removing his hand from Arthur's shoulder, and composed his face into the resigned expression of a man who has done what he could. Think about what I've said. You have my number. He turned back toward his group, smoothly and completely, the transition so practiced. It was almost elegant, from concerned friend back to laughing host, with no visible seam between the two states. Arthur watched him go. Then Arthur's gaze moved across the room to the far end of the bar, and found Leo Russo. Elena's younger brother was standing near the back wall in a sport coat that didn't quite fit him across the shoulders, with the slightly too alert expression of a man who had been monitoring exits. He was holding a drink he wasn't really drinking. He had not been here the last time Arthur attended this event. He had no obvious reason to be here now, at a fundraiser for the Asheville Arts Endowment, in a room full of people whose net worth exceeded Leo's annual income by factors that didn't bear calculation. Arthur watched Julian move toward Leo. He watched the brief, practiced movement of Julian's hand from jacket pocket to Leo's waiting palm. A cream-colored envelope, substantial enough to have weight, transferred in a motion so smooth and conversational it looked like a handshake between old acquaintances. He watched Leo slide the envelope into his inside pocket without looking at it. The gesture of a man who had done this before and knew better than to count it in public. He watched Leo look across the room at him. For a moment, their eyes met 40 feet of cocktail party between them, the noise and the laughter and the string quartet filling the space. Then Leo looked away, sharply, completely, with the deliberateness of a man removing himself from something he had agreed not to see. Arthur reached for the back of a nearby chair and gripped it with one hand, steadying himself. His fingers were trembling not with weakness, he registered with a kind of distant precision, but with the specific physical manifestation of an anger that was still in the process of organizing itself, still finding its shape and its direction. "I'm not crazy, Julian," he said to the space where Julian had been standing. His voice was quiet and level, the way it had always been on job sites when the situation required steadiness above everything else. "I'm an engineer. I know when a structure is being undermined." No one nearby responded. If anyone heard him, they took it for the muttering of a grief-confused old man at a party. That was fine. He wasn't speaking to be heard. He was speaking to set something in place, a reference point, a bearing mark. The kind of fixed coordinate you drove into solid ground before you began measuring anything. The string quartet was playing something he couldn't identify. Julian's laughter reached him from across the room in intervals, bright and social and completely indifferent to the world it occupied. It moved through Arthur like glass, not sharp exactly, but wrong in a way that registered in the body before it registered in the mind. He let go of the chair. He straightened his tie. He walked toward the exit without looking at Leo Russo again, and he did not look back. He came home to darkness. Not the familiar darkness of a house where the lights have been left off. The kind that holds the shape of known things, that yields to memory without resistance. This was flat and indifferent, the darkness of a house that had been switched off, and when Arthur reached for the hall light and found nothing. No click and no light, he understood before he checked anything else that the power had been cut. Another unpaid bill, another account Julian managed, another piece of the infrastructure of his life quietly redirected while he was looking elsewhere. He stood in the front hallway for a moment, letting his eyes use what light came through the window from the street lamp outside. The house arranged itself around him in shapes of gray and darker gray. Elena's coat hook was empty. The hall table held whatever was on it without revealing its contents. The smell of cedar from the workshop came faintly through the connecting door, muted. But present, the way Elena's presence was always still present in this house, never absent, only reduced to something he had to be still to notice. He turned around. He went back down the porch steps and sat in his truck in the driveway with the door closed and the engine off. The cab light was enough to see his phone. He opened his bank app, the personal checking account, the one connected to his own credentials and not Julian's management. The one that had never been worth Julian's direct attention because there had never been enough in it. Balance $142. He looked at the number for a long time. 40 years of building bridges. A 401k that had been healthy and properly funded when he had handed it to Julian Thorne at the beginning of a relationship. Built entirely on the conviction that Julian Thorne was a trustworthy person. $142. The neighborhood outside the truck windows was quiet. A dog barked twice somewhere to the south and went silent. The air through the slightly open window carried the smell of someone's garden, something sweet and new, entirely out of keeping with the moment. He drove to Leo's house. The rental on the west side of town had its lights on, the front curtains imperfectly drawn and showing a band of yellow light at the bottom. Arthur sat at the curb for a moment. Then he got out and knocked. The door opened after a pause that contained its own kind of conversation, the specific silence of someone deciding whether to answer. Leo Russo was still wearing the sport coat from the fundraiser, open now over a white undershirt. His eyes were red-rimmed in the way that came not from recent tears but from the kind of extended, low-level dissolution that sustained drinking produced. He was holding a glass. The apartment behind him was covered in paper collection notices. Arthur could see from the doorway, the kind with the bold bordered warnings. Several of them, on the kitchen table and the floor beside it and the arm of the couch. Arthur said, she knew. Elena knew what was happening. She wrote it down and hid the evidence, and I have all of it. Something moved across Leo's face, complicated and raw, there for a moment and then closed over. He didn't step back to allow Arthur inside. I saw you take the envelope, Arthur said. The complicated expression was gone. What replaced it had the form of defiance and the substance of a man who had run out of the energy required to maintain a performance. She was going to die anyway. He said it with the flatness of a justification that had been rehearsed past feeling. The doctors said. The cardiologist said she had 2 years, maybe less. Julian explained it to me, the outcome was the same regardless. At least this way I could get my life back. Clear the debts. Start over. Arthur said nothing. You were always too blind to see what was happening right under your nose. The flatness cracked, the whiskey and the guilt and the weight of it pouring through. Leo's voice was loud enough now to carry into the street. Too busy being the devoted husband, driving her to appointments, managing her pills, thinking Julian Thorne was your great friend. She didn't want you to know. She told me herself she didn't want you dragged into it because she knew what it would do to you. He stopped, breathing hard, the glass tight in his hand. Well, here you are. Arthur absorbed it. He let each piece of it settle into place. Julian had used Leo's gambling debts as a lever, specific debts to specific creditors who did not accept extensions. The kind of pressure that made a man willing to do things he would not otherwise consider. And Leo, who had sat at their Thanksgiving table and eaten Elena's cooking and accepted the money for their mother's medical bills, had sold his access to the house schedule, to the mail routing, to whatever Julian needed to know to operate invisibly inside their lives in exchange for relief from a debt he had accumulated at offshore betting tables. The betrayal was a closed circle. No gaps. No place where the structure failed. It had been load-bearing for more than a year, holding everything in place while everything was being taken apart. I am 65 years old, Arthur thought. The thought arrived with the calm specific to men who have completed damage assessments in dangerous places and know that panic uses resources that are needed for other things. I am 65 years old and I have no money and my wife is gone. And the man I trusted with our future spent 12 years taking it, and the man who was supposed to be family helped him do it because he owed money to people overseas. The world is empty in a way I did not know it had the capacity to be empty. He stepped back from the doorway. Leo was still speaking, something about the nature of debt, something about Arthur not understanding what it was like. Something that was becoming less coherent as it went on, but the words were not reaching Arthur anymore. Passing him without landing, the way wind passed through the supports of a bridge without moving the structure if the structure was properly designed. He walked back to the truck. He got in. He did not start the engine. He leaned his forehead against the cold curve of the steering wheel, the rubber worn smooth in the places his hands always found. Worn to the exact shape of 40 years of hands on wheels, of a man who had driven to job sites and hospitals and school events and grocery stores and every other geography of an ordinary life. The cold of it pressed against his skin, real and solid, and here. And Arthur stayed there in the dark of his truck on a quiet street in Asheville and wept, not loudly. Not with the performance of grief, but with the soundless, body-deep kind. The kind that comes when you have finally understood something you cannot ununderstand and the understanding is too large to do anything with except feel it completely. He wept for Elena. He wept for the 14 months of mornings he had spent simply missing her. When he should have been when she had been trying to ensure he could be finding this. He wept for the 40 years of careful work translated into $142 in a bank account. He wept for the trust he had extended, freely and completely, to a man who had spent 12 years treating it as a resource to extract. And then, after a while, he stopped. Not because it was over. Not because the weight had lifted. But because he was 65 years old, and he was an engineer, and the survey of the damage was complete. And engineers who had finished their damage surveys went to work. He lifted his head from the steering wheel. He started the engine. Friends, what a story this has been so far. Arthur Vance came home from 40 years of honest work believing his life was settled, his accounts managed, his house secure, his future protected. Then a hidden box in the wall of his wife's workshop turned everything he thought he knew inside out. Inside that box was something extraordinary: Elena's voice, steady and careful and loving, speaking to him from beyond her own death. The transfers, the ledger, the notebook titled The Price of Trust. She had been building a case while she was dying. Protecting her husband from the truth because she knew he wasn't ready for it yet. And then came the country club, and the cold eyes behind the warm smile, and Leo Russo taking an envelope and looking away. Arthur has lost nearly everything: his savings, his power, and for one terrible night on that dark street, very nearly himself. But he's still here. He got back in the truck. He started the engine. The question now is what an engineer does when he's completed his damage survey. And friends, I think you already know the answer to that. Stay with us. The second half of this story is where Arthur Vance truly begins. He drove without a destination for a while, letting the streets of Asheville organize themselves around him. In the familiar geometry of a city he had known for 4 decades. The River Arts District passed on his left, its converted warehouses dark at this hour except for the occasional lit studio window. He crossed the French Broad without really deciding to, and came back over it. And ended up, eventually, parked in the lot of a 24-hour diner on Merriman Avenue that he and Elena had gone to on the mornings after thunderstorms when they were too awake to stay in bed. He went inside and ordered coffee and sat in the booth by the window. The diner was mostly empty. A man at the counter read a newspaper. 2 women in nursing scrubs talked quietly in the back booth. The coffee, when it came, was hot and strong and tasted like the particular coffee of diners at 2 in the morning. Which was its own distinct category of thing. Arthur looked at his reflection in the window glass and thought about Elena. 14 months ago, she had been coughing the dry, persistent cough that the cardiologist had attributed to fluid pressure. The cough that had become so constant he had stopped fully hearing it, the way you stopped hearing traffic outside a window after you had lived with it long enough. She had been in the workshop, the back of it, near the storage shelves, and he had come in to tell her lunch was ready. She had been writing in the field notebook. He had seen her close it quickly as he entered, sliding it under a pile of wood shavings on the shelf. A motion casual enough that he had registered it only as Elena putting something away, not as Elena hiding something. She was always putting things away in the workshop. Always organizing and consolidating, the natural behavior of a person who spent serious time in a serious workspace. He had handed her the capsule. One of the ones from the amber bottle Julian had sent, the heart harmony formula. Which Julian had described in his accompanying note as a concentrated botanical compound proven to support cardiac rhythm. Julian says these help with the palpitations, honey. Just take it with lunch. She had held the capsule in her palm and looked at it for a moment. Then she had looked at Arthur, and now, sitting in the diner with the window reflection showing him a face he barely recognized as his own, he understood what that look had contained. He had read it at the time as tiredness, as the weary acceptance of someone who has taken too many pills to feel strongly about one more. It had not been that. It had been something far more specific and far more costly. She had known what was in the capsule. She had been documenting it. And she had taken it anyway, without telling him, because telling him would have required explaining what she knew, and explaining what she knew would have alerted Julian that the evidence gathering was happening, and she had not yet gathered enough. She had looked at him with that look, the one he had read as tired peace, and smiled. She had reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind his ear, the small habitual tenderness of 30 years of marriage. I love you, Arthur, she had said. Whatever happens, remember I was always looking out for us. He had said, I know you were, honey. He had not understood what she meant. He had understood it as one of the things people said when illness made the ordinary feel important. When the proximity of loss made people want to articulate what they usually let stand unspoken. He had been grateful for it. He had carried it through the months afterward as one of the last clear memories of her being present in herself. She was protecting me from the truth because she knew I wasn't strong enough for it then. He understood now. She had made the calculation, the same kind of engineering calculation he had spent his career making, the assessment of load and tolerance. And what a structure could bear, and she had concluded that the truth, delivered too early, would have broken something in him that could not be repaired in time to be useful. So she had carried it herself. She had carried it until she couldn't anymore, and then she had left him the box. The memory of her hand against his face felt like something branded warm and real and permanent, the kind of mark that didn't fade. He was still an engineer. Structures could be rebuilt. The question was what you built them with. Arthur finished his coffee, set a $10 bill on the table, and stood up. It was nearly 3 in the morning. He had a USB drive at home with 14 months of account records on it. He had a notebook with the names and dates and transfer amounts for $94,000. He had a blue pill organizer with unmarked capsules that he was fairly certain no licensed pharmacist had ever touched. And he had the name Margaret O'Shea, which he had seen on a sign outside a law office on Lexington Avenue. For years, every time he drove that route, without ever having a reason to go in. He had a reason now. He went back to the workshop the next morning. Not the way he had avoided it for 4 months, not the sideways approach. The stolen glance from the doorway, the retrieval of a single item, and the quick retreat. He went in deliberately, the way you enter a space you have decided to occupy. He stood in the center of it for a moment, among Elena's tools and Elena's smell and the half-finished birdhouse still waiting in the vise. And he let it all be present at once. The grief was there. He didn't push it aside. He simply made room for it alongside everything else he was carrying and moved to the main workbench. He cleared the surface. Not carelessly, he set each of Elena's tools in its proper place. The chisels in their rack, the router in its case. The measuring squares aligned along the back edge of the bench the way she had kept them. He was not erasing her. He was making the space available for what needed to happen next. He spread Elena's notebook open on the cleared bench, anchored at the corners with 2 bars clamps. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop, which he set beside the notebook. And opened the files Elena had organized with the same systematic care she had applied to everything she made. The files were arranged chronologically, labeled with dates and transaction types. Screenshots of account activity, PDF copies of wire transfer records. A folder labeled Shell Company's Notes that contained 3 pages of Elena's handwriting cross-referenced with printed excerpts from public corporate records. Tracing the path of the transferred funds through a series of LLCs with names that sounded like ordinary real estate holding companies and turned out, when you looked at the registered agents and formation dates and dissolution records, to be paper constructions. Scaffolding with nothing behind it. Arthur had designed enough complex structures to understand what he was looking at. He got a legal pad and a pen from the kitchen drawer and began mapping the transfers out of their account, the receiving entities. The dates of LLC formation relative to the dates of the transfers, the pattern of movement. He had done this kind of analysis professionally, tracing load distribution through complex systems, finding the points of concentration. It was the same process. The material was different. The method was identical. He worked through the morning and into the early afternoon, and by the time he drove to Lexington Avenue, he had a diagram that covered 4 pages of the legal pad and a reasonably clear picture of where the money had gone and through what sequence of constructed entities it had traveled. Margaret O'Shea's office was on the 2nd floor above a bookshop, reached by a staircase on the side of the building. The office itself was small and serious shelves of case files organized by colored tabs. A desk that held the controlled clutter of active work, diplomas on the wall from UNC Chapel Hill and Wake Forest Law. Margaret O'Shea was 58, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of direct, measuring gaze of someone who had spent 30 years listening to people tell her their problems and had learned to assess severity quickly. She listened without interrupting while Arthur laid it out. The quarterly statement and the unauthorized fee. The lockbox. Elena's notebook. The USB drive, which he had printed selected records from. The notice of delinquent mortgage. The shell company diagram on the legal pad pages, which he unfolded and smoothed on the desk between them. He set the blue pill organizer beside the papers, last. Margaret looked at it. Then she looked at the rest. Then she looked at Arthur. I don't want a settlement, he said. I want a conviction. I want them to see what happens when you try to erase a man who spent 40 years building bridges. Margaret's expression did not shift toward sympathy or pity. It shifted toward concentration, which was exactly what Arthur needed from her. She picked up the legal pad pages and studied them, turning through them in sequence. Occasionally making a small sound that indicated something had caught her attention. The pill organizer, she said. The unmarked capsules. You haven't opened them. I haven't touched them since I found them. Good. She set the legal pad down. We need a forensic toxicologist. We also need the wire transfer records subpoenaed through proper channels, because Elena's screenshots are valuable evidence of pattern. But they won't be sufficient on their own at a criminal standard. And we need a conversation on the record with Leo Russo. Arthur nodded. I can get Leo talking. He's been drinking since this started and he wants to tell someone. He told me half of it without me asking. Then ask him the rest, Margaret said, and record it. That evening Arthur drove to the west side of town for the second time in 48 hours. He parked on the same block, got out of the truck, and checked that his phone's audio recorder was running before he knocked on Leo's door. Leo answered looking worse than the last time, less assembled, the sport coat gone, the drink replaced by something he was drinking from a coffee mug in a way that suggested the contents were not coffee. He looked at Arthur with the eyes of a man who had been expecting this return and had not figured out how to handle it. I just want to understand it, Arthur said. I'm not here to fight. I just need to know how it started. Leo let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, the collection notices still spread across it. The room holding the smell of several days of closed windows and takeout containers. Leo talked for 40 minutes. He talked about the first approach from Julian, 3 years ago, framed as a business opportunity. He talked about the graduated escalation, the first small favor, then a larger one, then the point at which he was too deep to withdraw. He talked about the pills, Julian's personal chemist. He said, a man Leo had never met, who provided them in unlabeled bottles and whose name Julian had never shared. He talked about the money, the specific amounts, the dates, the accounts. He talked about Elena. She figured it out faster than Julian expected, Leo said. He was looking at the table, not at Arthur. Julian told me she'd started checking the account records. He wasn't worried, he said she was too sick to do anything about it. He thought she'd just stop taking the pills eventually when she realized something was off. He stopped. She didn't stop. Arthur turned off the recorder later in the truck. He sat for a moment with the device in his hand, the recording secure, and burned the memory care brochure. Julian had mailed him 6 weeks ago the one suggesting a facility in Fletcher with compassionate support for seniors experiencing cognitive transition. Not literally, because he was in the truck. But in the specific interior way of a man who has decided something is finished. He had found the brochure in his mailbox and felt afraid. He was not afraid now. You wanted me to forget, he thought. I have never remembered more clearly in my life. The cold anger he had been carrying since the diner on Merriman Avenue had settled, over the past 2 days, into something steadier and less combustible, not gone. But banked, the way you banked a fire when you needed it to last through the night. It was blue and even and reliable. It was exactly the temperature he needed. The Buncombe County Courthouse on College Street was a brick building with the deliberate solidity of civic structures. Built in an era when permanence was considered an architectural value. Arthur arrived early, wearing his good blazer again, the navy one, the tie Elena had given him, and sat in the parking lot for several minutes before going in. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of April morning that had no weather in it, just light. He had brought nothing with him. Everything he needed was already inside. The formal hearing had been scheduled following 6 weeks of preparation. That Arthur experienced as the most focused period of his life since the Swannanoa River Bridge project 30 years before. 6 weeks of depositions. Evidence organization, forensic analysis, and the particular kind of sustained patience that legal proceedings required from the people whose lives they concerned. Margaret had guided him through each step with the directness he had come to rely on. She didn't soften things or manage his expectations. She told him what was true, what was uncertain, and what still needed work, and Arthur understood that language and appreciated it. The courtroom was smaller than the ones on television. Wood-paneled, with tall windows that admitted the morning light at a low angle that illuminated the dust in the air. The gallery held perhaps 30 people, some of them faces Arthur recognized from the Asheville financial community, people who had known Julian Thorne for years and were present to understand what they were hearing. Julian Thorne sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Arthur's truck. He was composed. His attorney, a man named Carver who had been composed in equal measure throughout the proceedings, sat beside him with a legal pad. Julian had looked at Arthur once when he entered the courtroom and then not again. That single glance had contained nothing Arthur could read. It was perfectly blank, which was its own kind of information. Margaret presented the forensic toxicology report first. The toxicologist, a woman who taught at UNC Asheville and had been brought in through the medical examiner's office, described the contents of the capsules and the blue pill organizer with the level of technical specificity that Arthur had requested when Margaret asked him how detailed he wanted the presentation. Concentrated digitalis glycosides, she said, derived from foxglove plant material and prepared in a formulation inconsistent with any licensed pharmaceutical product. Administered regularly at the documented dosage and frequency. She said, the compound would produce a progressive cardiac arrhythmia indistinguishable from natural heart disease in patients with existing cardiac conditions. It would be very difficult to identify without specific targeted testing, she said. She looked at Julian Thorne once during this portion of her testimony, and then looked back at the judge. Detective Simmons from the Buncombe County Financial Crimes Unit presented the wire transfer records next, not the screenshots from Elena's secondary login, which were admitted as evidence of documented pattern, but the official subpoenaed records from the relevant financial institutions. He walked through the diagram Arthur had drawn on the legal pad, now reproduced on large format sheets and properly labeled with the subpoenaed confirmation data attached. The money had not disappeared, he explained. Money rarely disappeared. It moved. It had moved from the Vance retirement account through 4 sequential LLC entities, 3 registered in Delaware, 1 in Nevada, and had emerged, at the end of the chain, in payments to a series of offshore creditors whose accounts corresponded to the specific gambling debts of Leo Russo. The audio recording of Leo's kitchen table conversation came in through Margaret's presentation, played through the courtroom speaker system. Leo's voice was flat and slightly slurred in the recording, and the specific quality of it a man talking not to confess, but simply because he had been alone with this for too long was audible in the courtroom. Leo himself was not present. He was in a different building on a different floor, having accepted a separate proceeding. The judge was a woman in her 60s named the Honorable Patricia Calder. With the measured, unhurried manner of someone who had been listening to people tell her the truth and its opposites for many years and had developed a reliable method for distinguishing between them. She had asked precise questions throughout the proceeding. Now she looked at the evidence summary on the desk before her, and then at Julian Thorne, and then at Arthur. Mr. Vance, she said, I want to offer you an apology on behalf of this court and this process. You came to us when many people in your position would have accepted what was being done to them as simply the bad luck of old age and grief. You did not. The record will reflect that you were never the confused party in this matter. Arthur nodded. His hands, folded on the table before him, were steady. Julian Thorne was led from the courtroom 40 minutes later by a court officer, the handcuffs applied with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a routine procedure. He walked with the posture of a man who had not yet fully accepted what was happening, which was its own kind of information about the quality of his judgment. Arthur watched him go. He did not feel what he had expected to feel, not triumph, not the satisfaction of a score settled, not the release of something long compressed. He felt, instead, something quieter. Something that had the texture of a room after a long storm had passed. Today the court wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence, he thought. Leo was brought through the courtroom corridor an hour later, after his own proceeding concluded. He was accompanied by an officer and wore the expression of a man who had reached the far side of a decision he had made, and was only now fully understanding its weight. He passed within 10 feet of where Arthur stood. Arthur did not look away from him, and Leo did not look at Arthur, not with the sharp deliberate avoidance of the country club, but with the downcast, diminished eyes of someone who had stopped having anything to say. Arthur signed the restitution documentation that Margaret placed in front of him in the courthouse conference room afterward. The full $94,000 of documented theft, plus calculated interest, plus additional damages assessed through the court's finding. It would not restore 14 months. It would not restore Elena. It was not intended to. It was the court's translation of a wrong into a language the law recognized, and the law's acknowledgement that the wrong had existed and had been seen. His hand was steady when he signed his name. He stood outside on the courthouse steps in the April afternoon light, Margaret beside him, and breathed the air of a city that was continuing its ordinary business without any awareness of what had just concluded inside the building. A bus passed on College Street. 2 students from the university walked past with coffee cups. The Blue Ridge stood to the east and north in its permanent position, the same hills that had been there before the courthouse and would be there after it. The courtroom air had felt breathable, he realized. For the first time in a very long time, it had simply felt like air. Spring came fully to Asheville in the way it always had, not all at once but in accumulations, each warm day. Adding to the account until one morning you looked outside and understood that the balance had tipped and the season had actually arrived. The dogwood in the backyard bloomed. The red bud along the fence line came in purple before the leaves did. The French Broad ran high and fast with snowmelt from the higher elevations. The particular gray-green of mountain water carrying its spring load toward the lowlands. Arthur was in the workshop. He had come back to it gradually over the weeks following the courthouse, the way you return to a place that holds significant memory cautiously at first, then more completely, then with the ease of someone who has made peace with what the place contained. He had reorganized the tool racks the way Elena kept them, straightened the lumber stack, cleaned the router bits and hung them in their labeled case. He had done these things slowly and on no particular schedule, and each completed task had felt like a conversation. This morning he unclamped the birdhouse from the vise. Elena had gotten it to the stage of basic assembly, the 4 walls joined, and the floor fitted, the entry hole cut with the spade bit in the precise 1.5-inch diameter that admitted a Carolina wren but excluded most of the larger species that would crowd them out. She had done the primary shaping and joinery. What remained was the roof, 2 angled cedar panels that needed to be fitted and glued and secured with the small brass pins. She had already sorted into a glass jar on the shelf, in the way she sorted hardware for projects she intended to finish. Arthur looked at the jar. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, set it on the bench beside the birdhouse. He found her notes. She kept project notes clipped to a board above each active workbench, measurements, material notes, reminders to herself about joinery order. The notes for the birdhouse were still there, 4 months and more after her hands had put them up. Roof angle 22. Brass pins, pre-drill 116. Glue first, pin after. Her handwriting. Her planning, still organized and present and waiting. He found her bevel gauge set to 22 degrees in the tool rack. He worked slowly, the way Elena worked, not rushing toward completion but attending to each step completely before moving to the next. He fitted the first roof panel, checked the angle with her gauge, marked the pin locations, pre-drilled the holes with the 116 bit, applied the glue. He set the first panel and waited while it tacked. Then the second. Then the pins, tapped in gently with the ball-peen hammer she kept for this purpose. It took most of the morning. When it was finished, he set it on the secondary bench and looked at it. Cedar, with the tight grain that came from old growth trees, aged to the particular amber that was somewhere between honey and wood smoke. The roof line was clean. The entry hole was centered. The brass pins were countersunk and would weather to the same color as the wood within a season. It was a good birdhouse. It was Elena's birdhouse. He had finished it, and the finishing of it felt like both an ending and a beginning, which was perhaps the only way anything worth finishing ever felt. 2 weeks later, Arthur stood in the community room of the Westside Senior Center on Haywood Road. In front of a group of 22 men and women whose ages ranged from 60 to 83, and told them what had happened to him. He told it plainly, without drama. The way an engineer described a structural failure, here was the system. Here was the point of failure. Here was what the failure looked like and why it had been difficult to detect. He showed them Julian Thorne's pattern, the specific language Julian had used to build trust and then leverage it. He showed them the warning signs Elena had documented. He showed them the technique Julian had used to intercept mail, to position himself as a gatekeeper, to become the intermediary through whom information flowed and could be controlled. He talked about tech support scams, the calls from numbers designed to look like Microsoft or Social Security. The urgency manufactured to bypass careful thinking, the specific phrases that indicated a script. He talked about financial elder abuse, the most common form. He told them, and the most underreported, because it was usually committed by people the victim trusted and because the victim often blamed themselves for the trust. He talked about the documentation habits Elena had developed, the secondary account login, the photographs of statements before they were filed. He talked about the box in the wall. The room was quiet in the way of people who are listening with full attention, which was a different quality of quiet from the room being simply empty of sound. Several people took notes. A woman in the third row asked about the warning signs in quarterly statements. A man near the window asked about what to do if you suspected a family member. Arthur answered each question completely, without abbreviating, because the questions were good ones and the people asking them deserved complete answers. He had found, in the weeks since the courthouse, that this was where the weight had gone. Not into relief, exactly, though there was relief. Not into anger, which had done its work and been spent. It had settled into purpose, the specific, directed purpose of a man who had survived something and understood that the survival created an obligation. He had been taken apart and he had put himself back together. And the knowledge he had was knowledge that could help people who hadn't been where he had been yet but who might be on their way there. He drove home afterward along the river road, windows down, the afternoon air doing what May air in Asheville did when it was being its best self. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment. On the kitchen counter, inside the house, was the restored Social Security notice, a document confirming the reinstatement of the benefits that had been misdirected through Julian's management arrangement. The benefits that were now properly routed to Arthur's own account again. It was just paper. He knew that. The real wealth of a life was not paper. And he had always known that, and the past year had confirmed it in the way that only direct experience could confirm anything. He walked to his truck bed and retrieved the small object he had carved during the past week from a piece of scrap cedar from Elena's stack, a bird. Roughly the size of a Carolina wren, with the shape suggested. Rather than detailed, the kind of carving a woodworker makes at the end of a day when the work is done and the hands want to keep moving. He had sanded it smooth and left it unfinished, the way cedar aged best when left to find its own color. The cemetery was 10 minutes north of town, on a hillside property with an old stone wall and a view of the mountains on clear days. Elena's headstone was gray granite, her name and dates and the single line she had once mentioned, years ago. Wanting on it when the time came, she made things that lasted. Arthur set the cedar bird on the headstone, in the notch between the top of the stone and the carved lettering. It fit there as though the space had been intended for it, which seemed right in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't been where he had been. He stood for a while in the May afternoon, with the Blue Ridge going blue in the middle distance and the air moving gently through the cemetery grass. And he talked to her, the way he had talked to her every week since the courthouse. He told her about the senior center presentation. He told her the birdhouse was finished. He told her the cardinal had found it already, which it had, 3 days after he hung it in the dogwood. At 65, I finally learned that starting over isn't failure. He thought, the words arriving with the ease of something that had been understood for a while and was only now finding its language. It's freedom. It's what you build after the bridge survives the flood, not the same bridge. But something stronger in the places that cracked, something that knows what water it has to hold. He placed his hand briefly on the headstone, on her name, on the letters. She had carried through her life until the letters were all that remained, and they remained. He walked back to his truck in the May afternoon. The Blue Ridge stood where it always stood. The cedar bird sat in its notch, already beginning to weather to the color of the stone around it, the way good cedar did when you let it become what it was. Friends, how did you find today's story? I've been sitting with Arthur Vance for the past hour, and I have to tell you this one stayed with me. Not just the betrayal, though that was breathtaking in the worst possible way. Not just the justice at the end, though that was exactly as satisfying as we needed it to be. What stayed with me was Elena. Elena, who figured it out while she was dying. Elena, who kept her notebook and her USB drive and her blue pill organizer in a lockbox behind the wall of her own workshop, because she knew the combination was their anniversary date. And she knew her husband would be the one to find it. She couldn't protect herself, but she made sure she could protect him even from beyond her own life. That is a particular kind of love that I think most of us understand, even if we've never been tested the way Elena was. The love that keeps working after the person is too tired to keep working. The love that says, I can't fix this, but I can leave you what you need to fix it yourself. And Arthur, 65 years old, bankrupt, sitting in the dark cab of his truck leaning his head against the steering wheel and then getting up. Going to the diner, drinking cold coffee in a booth at 2 in the morning and deciding that the damage survey was complete and now it was time to build. That is what this story is really about. Not revenge, exactly. Purpose. The choice to take what you've survived and make it useful. We all face moments where the structure we built our life on turns out to have been compromised somewhere we weren't looking. Where the numbers don't add up and the person we trusted isn't who we believed them to be. Those moments are devastating. They are also, and I believe this, the places where we find out what we are actually made of. Arthur found out he was made of 40 years of careful engineering and one extraordinary wife who loved him enough to leave him everything he needed. I hope this story brought you something today. A little comfort, maybe. A little fire. A reminder that starting over is not failure, it is, as Arthur said, freedom. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear about it.